Good morning, Stefan. Last time when we spoke, you gave us a brief rundown and really introduction to golden hydrogen, which was an interesting story. And I think there were a couple of points that we covered that needed a few more words on our explanations rather. So one of them was safety. So let's talk about safety. So you claim that CO2-2-H2, golden H2, is 100% safe and leak-proof, but we both know that nothing is ever 100% safe. So why do you claim this?
Yeah, 99.999% rounds to 100%. But anyway, semantics aside, what I'm trying to say with this is that CO2-2-H2, is an order of magnitude safer than all the alternatives that we have and all the other processes that do something similar. And let's start with Groningen, my obsession, as you know, and discuss earthquakes there. So the Groningen dilemma is that depletion causes subsidence and stress in the overburden, which causes earthquakes. And the question is, what happens if we repressurize that field reservoir? Now, my mental model here is that of a 45-kilometer long bridge, which is supported by a depleted football. So initially, the overburden, rests on that football, which is full, everything's fine. And then we're, kind of letting the air out of that football and everything comes down a little bit and subsides. Now, personally, if I was driving on that bridge, I'd feel more comfortable if somebody would repressurize that football. But the reality is that nobody knows what will happen. So would that make the earthquakes better or worse is unknown. It depends on the elastic properties of the overburden here. But with CO2-2-H2, we can at least adjust the pressure in such a way that it doesn't drop anymore. Because that's the one thing that you mustn't do with Groningen now, deplete the field further. And also, and this is a statement about, in general, the safety of CO2-2-H2. Had we done CO2-2-H2 from day one in Groningen, then there wouldn't have been, earthquakes or subsidence in the first place, because we, never would have depleted that football in the first place.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, but you know that this requires onshore carbon capture and storage, or as you would call it, CO2 injection in onshore gas fields. So onshore carbon capture and storage, how can this be saved? There are so many concerns.
Yeah, and thank you for asking the question that way, because indeed injecting into gas reservoirs makes all the difference in the world. So, even though some CCS projects also target gas reservoirs, the vast majority injects into aquifers, which is water-filled sand bodies here, and they're not depleted like gas reservoirs. And let's look at some of the issues that these early projects had. They all had to do with pressure control and losses of CO2 leaks. So the first one, the first commercial one, was Sleipner, where the CO2 escaped via a subseismic fault, which wasn't previously seen on seismic. Insala, another early big one, the CO2 escaped via an up-dip exploration well, which was obviously poorly abandoned. Gorgon, they tried to solve these pressure control problems by having some sort of dump flood well, which would provide pressure relief. from that sand where you're injecting into a lower sand. And that was a good idea, but unfortunately the completions failed, so that well plugged up, and that so basically that plant didn't work anymore, and Gorgon and everything was delayed. So none of this can happen with CO2-2-H2. We inject into gas reservoirs below initial pressure, which is inherently much safer. And technical blueprint for CO2-2-H2 is really underground gas storage. It's not CCS. So if you look at these little cartoons down here, a finance manager actually recently asked me, can you inject CO2 and produce gas at the same time? That would be the perfect cycle, he said. And it's an interesting question, because in oil we're doing that all the time. We're injecting CO2 into producing oil reservoirs, and that's called CO2 flooding or enhanced oil recovery. And it's absolutely safe, and it actually allows you to produce more oil than previously. Now with gas reservoirs, we have the additional advantage that the CO2 is heavier than gas. So, the gas actually forms a little buffer between, the actual top seal and the CO2 we injected. If indeed there was a leak, which geologically is impossible, then the gas would come out first. So geologically the risk of CO2 leaks is zero. That gas has been in the reservoir for millions of years, geological time. We're exchanging molecules, and therefore that CO2 will stay in the reservoir for millions of years.
Yeah, so you draw the analogy to gas storage essentially, but what about well leaks? I mean, the fields you're talking about weren't designed for gas storage in the first place. There are old wells in those fields. So what about well leaks in general? How do you make sure that it doesn't occur or is manageable?
Yeah. So that little cartoon down here, shows you what we mean by these drilling-induced leak paths. Sorry. And that's indeed what had happened in Salah. But we have to be mindful that was an old exploration well, which was obviously dry, didn't find any gas. So there's no need to really properly cement that well, and certainly properly abandon that well, because water flow as such is harmless. Now the situation in gas fields is completely different. Certainly modern gas wells, they are properly cemented, and if need be, they'll be properly abandoned. Modern cement is a lot longer lasting than was in the old days. So I agree with you. If we had very old wells, and we may not know about the vintage of these wells or who actually drilled them, that could be a problem. In Groningen specifically, we know who drilled them, we know when these wells were drilled, and I personally believe it's not a problem. But I'm not an expert really in well integrity, so we definitely have a lot of mitigations as well, against that risk of gas penetrating that cement and creeping up to the surface. We simply need to monitor the reservoir pressure in these wells and keep them open for a couple of years or many years after the field is shut in. And if that pressure stays constant, then we know that all the seals are still working. Everything is still sealing. And indeed, if the pressure should start to drop, then we have quite some time to react and repair those wells before the CO2 actually should come to surface.
Yeah, now CO2 in certain sort of chemical environments can be quite problematic. So what about corrosion or chemical reactions in a reservoir? Have you thought about that?
Yeah. And let's talk about the Danbury pipeline rupture. So, if you read the headlines about this, it's really doom and gloom, right? This one reads here, CO2 pipeline rupture in Mississippi points to health risks in carbon capture expansion. So this is a well here which sends CO2 from the source, where they capture the CO2, to a storage site. And it obviously ruptured and people got sick, had to be taken to the hospital and all the rest of it. So it sounds terrible. But if you read the small print or the full text, really, you find that that's not a CO2 pipeline at all. It's a CO2 and hydrogen sulfide, H2S pipeline. And H2S, is highly corrosive and highly toxic. And I'm not quite sure if any of these gases, actually causes green fog to appear, as they're saying here. So it's very likely that they transported all kinds of other toxic waste and just to dump it there. So, pure CO2 is not corrosive and does not cause reservoir souring. But we have to avoid impurities, of course. So H2S, H2O, water, any sort of nutrients and bacteria that could react in the reservoir, we have to avoid. But with golden hydrogen or CO2-2-H2, we control the whole process. And number one, we avoid pipeline transport as much as possible. And but that also goes for the well and the reservoir itself. With pure CO2, it's not a risk. And just to iterate on that, the Cortez pipeline is the mother of all CO2 pipelines. It goes from Colorado all the way through New Mexico to Texas and the Permian CO2 floods there since 1980, 500-mile long and transporting 1.5 BCF per day of CO2. And I'm not aware of any corrosion problems in that pipeline.
You mentioned earlier that CO2-2H2 is more analogous to underground gas storage, essentially. Can you elaborate a little bit on that one again? Why do you say that is the case?
Yes, absolutely. And this is really my main message here. Let's look at the pressure profiles of UGS, underground gas storage, versus CO2-2H2 versus CCS here on the right. CO2-2H2 has the most benign pressure profile, and we actually just restore the natural pressure equilibrium, more or less hydrostatic pressure that existed in the reservoir before we depleted it. So this in the middle here is that pressure profile. We start from 100% of initial pressure, deplete it down, and when we decide to go to CO2-2H2, we gradually increase the pressure to either 100% or just under 100% of initial. In the case of Groningen, we need to be extra careful, so we just make sure that the pressure stays at the current level. Now, that compares to a pressure profile of a typical UGS, where we're doing that every year. We're drawing the pressure down to 30% of initial. If that's the cushion gas, 30%, we have to draw it down to 30% to get all the working gas, and then back up to 100% and do that every year. So, if a reservoir can tolerate, this UGS pressure profile with all these humps and bumps and wear and tear, without leaks or earthquakes, then it can definitely tolerate this CO2-2H2 pressure profile. And both, again, let me iterate, they stay below initial pressure. Whereas with the CCS injecting into aquifers, the pressure goes above initial right from day one. And then, as far as I'm concerned, all bets are off. It's a completely different risk profile, and you just don't know what's going to happen because you've never been there with your pressure. So that's why I think permitting of CO2-2H2 projects, they should be based on UGS permitting and not on CCS permitting.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. Now, all in all, this sounds almost too good to be true. So why aren't we just doing it then?
Yeah, indeed. It's the permitting process. At least that's one of the big reasons it's holding us up. People don't fully understand all the safety implications, and radical environmentalists, play with the deeply rooted fears in the general public. So this then, coupled with a complex and fragmented permitting process in Europe, which can be further delayed by litigations from these pressure groups, makes it very, very difficult. Did you know, for instance, that in Europe, every country has its own permitting process, and in Germany, even every Bundesland has their own permitting process.
Yeah, indeed, I'm aware of that, and it doesn't make sense. That doesn't make things easier for sure. Final question, Stefan: what support do you need?
Oh boy, where do I start? So technology is easy and stakeholder management is hard. What we need is a shitstorm for golden hydrogen. Call it a gold storm. We need support from local legislators and regulators, as I just said, from NGOs, and especially from moderate environmentalists. We call them Realos in Germany. So we need a broad public debate on all pros and cons of golden hydrogen, where we can objectively discuss these fears versus the benefits of CO2-2-H2, and then hopefully get to a streamlined permitting process throughout Europe.
Yeah, no, thanks for that final answer to my final question. Having said final, there is a couple of things I think we need to bottom out still. There is strategic gas storage aspects. I would like to hear a bit more about that in a future recording, or geopolitical aspects. But for today, thanks, Stefan, for your time and for the good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.